Today's guest is a distinguished Princeton professor, an in-demand public speaker, and a 3-time recipient of the Lincoln Prize, among other prestigious honors. Author Alan Guelzo is here to discuss a Confederate icon of the American Civil War, and I'll speak with him next. I'm Robert Child, and this is Point of the Spear. Welcome back. His recent book is called Robert E. Lee, Alive, and author Alan Guelzo joins us now. Alan, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Rob. It's good to be in touch with you again. We have been in touch off and on over the years, actually going all the way back to a sort of Lee project with the film you made on Lincoln and Lee at Antietam.
Absolutely. And I looked at that the other day on Amazon Prime. And we all look a lot younger. It came out in 2005.
I wonder why.
Yeah, exactly. Time has a way of doing that. Let's get into the questions I had. Lee is such an enigma, the Marble Man, obviously. Tell me about how you believe his essentially growing up without a father impacted his life.
It's curious to see how often people refer to Lee using the word marble or things like it. Montgomery Meigs, who most of us will identify, if we're Civil War people, as the Union Quartermaster General during the war, actually served under Meigs when he was a shave-tailed lieutenant, fresh out of West Point, on the project Lee was working on with the St. Louis waterfront. And Meigs just thought of Lee as the absolute model of gentility. He described Lee as being noble and commanding, but also, and here's the marble part, one with whom nobody ever wished to take a liberty. John Schofield, who would later become a Union general and go on to become a superintendent of West Point, did the same thing. He called Lee the personification of dignity, justice, and kindness, the ideal of a commanding officer. And the mother of one cadet actually had her son describe Lee literally as a marble model. Although when she actually visited West Point and met Lee, she found him to be very human, kind, calm, and definite. So maybe marble is not quite the best image. And maybe if what you see on the outside is something hard, it's because he's protecting something on the inside. And I think that's what's linked with the fact that his famous father, and his father was famous. Right. His father was Harry Lee, Light Horse Harry Lee, the famous cavalryman of the Revolutionary War, especially of the Southern Campaign, the man who delivered the eulogy for George Washington, first in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen. A man who had carved out a tremendous reputation in the war, but who was a complete loss when it came to peacetime. He married first one of his cousins, Matilda Lee, and that made him the master of the ancestral Lee estate of Stratford, right, on the northern neck of Virginia. And then after her death, he married a Carter, Ann Carter, which was supposed to get him lots of money. Well, yeah, it got him lots of money, which he proceeded to burn through in these witless real estate schemes in Western Virginia, to the point where, in fact, he loses control of Stratford, moves to Alexandria, and then finally leaves the family completely when Robert is 6 years old for the West Indies, a couple of steps ahead of his creditors. Robert never sees his father again. I think that creates a wound, because as Leon Edel, a great writer about the English literary scene, said, there's no wound so deep, so lasting as the loss of a parent before the onset of adolescence. And I think you find that in Lee over and over and over again. I think there's one thing that's very curious about Robert Lee. Despite the fame of his father, and before the Civil War, whenever Robert Lee is introduced to people, it's always, and this is the son of Light Horse Harry Lee.
Right.
Robert himself never talks about his father. He never visits his father's grave until 1861. In other words, not until he finally starts to achieve some standing of his own. He finally have some degree of ease and coming to grips with the legacy of the failed legacy of his father. And then towards the end of his life, in the post-war years, he actually writes the longest single sustained essay he ever writes. And it's a biographical essay about his father. One in which he covers up every failing of his father. But that failure, that absence of the father, just leaves this hole in Robert's life. And I think you see over and over again how that drives him to three things. It drives him to desire independence, and it drives him for a desire for security.
Right.
And it drives him to a desire, ultimately, to be the perfect example of what his father wasn't. In other words, he was going by his behavior to perfect all the imperfections that Harry Lee had created. It's when you consider those three things, that drive for independence, that drive for security, that drive for perfection, that's what really makes up the marble in the Marble Man.
I agree. And reading your book, what struck me about his father's money issues, I thought connected with Robert E. Lee and his concern with money, and that you bring up. I thought
yes.
You know, a great deal. He was always concerned about the money. You know.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't that he was greedy, because in fact, when his mother dies in 1829, there is a reasonably substantial legacy that comes to Robert and his two brothers. Taken together, if you judge by how he invested it, by the 1840s, he's accumulated a fund of the modern equivalent of almost $1 million. It's not that he's poor.
Right.
But he's one of these people who can never convince himself that this is going to be permanent. Something is always going to lose it. Something's always going to take it away, just the way it got taken away from his father. So he's always worrying about money. He had what you might call he had the avarice of the keep, not the avarice of the get. He had the avarice of the keep. He was always convinced it was never enough.
Yeah, and I truly got that with your book. I want to jump ahead to from his youth to after West Point. What was his first command after West Point?
Well, as a newly minted lieutenant of engineers, and bear in mind, he graduates second in his class at West Point, misses first by just a whisker of a few points. But he graduated, and by the way, whoever remembers who graduated first ahead of Robert E. Lee? Not entirely. It was a man named Charles Mason, who later goes on to become a lawyer and a judge out in the West. But Lee takes a commission as a brevet second lieutenant, as all graduates at West Point did at that point. And his first assignment is to Cockspur Island. That's an island in the estuary, the mouth of the Savannah River. And the task was to begin the construction of what becomes Fort Pulaski. Now, this is an interesting story in its own right, because it means that Robert Lee starts his engineering career in the Army in a specialty form of engineering that we call coastal engineering.
Okay.
I am not an engineer, so I had to give myself something of a crash course in the nature of the history of engineering, different varieties of engineering, what kind of education went into it, what kind of practice, what the dynamics of it were. Lee's projects, starting with Cockspur Island, are almost all coastal engineering projects. In other words, he doesn't build bridges, doesn't build railroads, doesn't build canals. He is engaged in coastal engineering. And coastal engineering is a phenomenally difficult branch of engineering because there are so many variables in it at such great distances. I mean, for instance, you can be building a project at one point on a river or on a lake, but what's going to affect that construction can really emerge 100, 150 miles away at the other end of a lake, at rapids, at the upper end of a river. And you've got to take all of that into account. It is so unpredictable. So it's a real challenge. And I have to say that for this first project, it's not entirely successful. His commanding officer is an old-time Army engineer named Babcock. He doesn't like Lee. Lee doesn't like him. The project really doesn't go anywhere very well. And Babcock takes himself off the scene. He is succeeded by Joseph Mansfield, a name worth remembering because he will later meet Robert E. Lee on the field of battle at Antietam in 1862. Well, Mansfield is sent to Pulaski or to Cockspur Island to take charge, and even then, it's not happy. Lee complains about him being harassed by Mansfield. Lee, give us a sketch of that. Lee, give us a sketch of this. He doesn't like being bossed around like that, especially when he sees no point to it. Right. So that's really his first assignment. After that, he's called to Fort Monroe to begin the construction of a secondary fortification that is called Fort Calhoun in the waterways of Hampton Roads, more coastal engineering. And from there, he's assigned to St. Louis to deal with the fact that the St. Louis waterfront was silting up. And it was silting up in a way that would have been disastrous for St. Louis. I mean, if it had kept up at the rate it was doing, St. Louis would today be an inland town in Missouri. What Lee is basically tasked with is making sure that doesn't happen, working the channel of the river in a different direction so that the river continues to flow past the St. Louis waterfront. And to do that, he's not only got to build elaborate dikes to channel the river at St. Louis, but he has to deal with the real cause of the problem, which is 150 miles upriver at the Des Moines Rapids. So here is a major challenge in coastal engineering. And Lee is involved in that over a period of 4 years, trying to rebuild that and securing St. Louis and St. Louis's economic position as a major port city on the inland waterways.
I'm sure a lot of people never knew he was an engineer.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's not what I would call the most exciting part of anyone's biography, because we don't usually rush out to buy biographies of engineers. Right. Now, every engineer who's listening to me say that will immediately put a black mark beside my name. I hope they don't. I'm not saying that in any way that runs down engineers, believe me. But what we don't often understand about Lee is that he spends most of his career as an engineer building things. Right. And he never actually this is a surprising thing, but he never actually commands troops under fire until 1859, when he's in charge of the Marines who suppressed the John Brown insurrection at Harper's Ferry.
Tell us a little bit about that incident, the John Brown incident.
Well, in October of 1859, John Brown, the radical abolitionist, hatched his plan to trigger a slave insurrection. He would begin this by descending on the federal armory and arsenal at Harper's Ferry. That would be where he'd obtain weapons and hostages, and then hightail it to the West Virginia mountains, where he would call slaves to his side and establish a sort of quasi-republic of slave refugees in the Western Virginia mountains, in the Appalachians, where they could fight off anyone who tried to suppress this uprising. And that would, Brown hoped, completely destabilize the slave system throughout the South. Well, in practice, the raid turns out to be a botch. Mm-hmm. And Robert E. Lee happened to be in Washington at the time the news of the Brown raid at Harper's Ferry comes into the hands of the Secretary of War. He was the senior U.S. Army officer right within the reach of the district. So he is called over to the Secretary of War, John Floyd, and assigned an aide, a former student of his, James Ewell Brown Stewart, Jeb Stewart, and sent off with a company of Marines to suppress the Brown uprising, which he does, partly because Brown's people are really so disorganized. They're already besieged by Virginia and Maryland militia, but also because Lee does a really good job of organizing his Marines, setting out a picket line, clearing the town, presenting an ultimatum, and then storming the engine house in which Brown had holed up with his men, and taking them prisoner or killing those who resisted. And it's almost a model. It is done so cleanly, so neatly, that it was all over really in less time than it has taken me to describe it. So it's a remarkable accomplishment for Robert E. Lee, especially when, as I say, when you consider this is the first time he's actually commanding troops under fire. Granted, it's a very small scale event, but still, it spoke very well of Lee, and it held Lee up for admiration in many quarters, especially in Virginia.
He had a reputation, obviously, going into the Civil War, and he knew a lot of the Union generals. What were the opinions of the generals to Robert E. Lee? I mean, were they frightened?
It varied. The pre-war army, of course, was a very small army, approximately 16,000 men all told, officers and enlisted. And as a relatively small cadre, they knew each other. They had been at West Point together. A number of them had been on campaign together in Mexico. So a lot of them knew each other and knew stories about the others and had an estimate of what the others were like. They were not strangers. Right. Union general reactions, though, to Lee being in command were surprising, because at first, the reaction almost bordered on contempt. Lee was given, as an initial command, the oversight of the West Virginia campaign of the late summer and fall of 1861. Western Virginia had never been enthused about joining the rest of the Commonwealth of Virginia in secession. And no sooner does Virginia announce its secession and its joining of the Confederate States than the westernmost counties decide that they're going to go their own way. In effect, they are going to secede from secession. And they organize a provisional government of Virginia, which at first they insist is the legitimate government of Virginia. And they are prepared to resist the Confederacy and to assist them. Union forces from Ohio under George McClellan cross the Ohio River into Western Virginia and establish Union control over a great deal of what is now the modern day state of West Virginia. Robert E. Lee was sent by Jefferson Davis to deal with that, and he was not successful. In large measure, he was not successful because the terrain was difficult. The soldiers that he had to command were untrained and of dubious quality, and the officers that he had to cope with were uncooperative, and all the more so because the actual lines of authority were not clear. Jefferson Davis sent him to Western Virginia to give oversight to the situation. That was not quite the same thing as command authority to get people to work together, and they didn't. So his initial campaign is not a terribly successful one. And when in 1862, after the wounding of Joe Johnston, at the end of May 1862 at Seven Pines on the Peninsula Campaign, it is announced by Jefferson Davis that Johnston will be succeeded by Robert E. Lee. The first response on the part of the opposite number, which in this case, again, is George McClellan, commanding the Army of the Potomac.
Right.
McClellan's first response is, we don't really have too much to worry about from Lee. Lee's very timid. He will not do anything particularly spectacular. Oh, what a mistake that was. Lee instead turns into a fireball of aggressiveness, pushes McClellan away from Richmond, away from the Chickahominy River crossings, and forces McClellan to abandon his base at White House on the Pamunkey River, which curiously enough was an old Custis Lee property, and forces McClellan to regroup around Harrison's Landing on the James River. By this point, it's clear that McClellan has the scare on him. And McClellan is bombarding Washington with demands for reinforcements and accusations that Washington is not supporting him. In fact, the truth is Washington was not really supporting him. Washington had already given up on George McClellan, and President Lincoln would probably have been happy to have relieved McClellan of command on the spot had it not been for the fact that McClellan enjoyed such commanding loyalty in the Army of the Potomac. What Lincoln does instead is to create an alternative army in Northern Virginia called the Army of Virginia, which he puts under the command of John Pope. Pope's response to Lee is actually not all that much different from McClellan's. He immediately stages a retreat from an advanced position he'd taken at the Rappahannock River, pulls back into Northern Virginia, hopes he can isolate one part of Lee's army at the Old Manassas battlefield, only to find himself caught in the jaws of Lee's army and suffers one of the most embarrassing and humiliating defeats a Union army suffers in the Civil War. After that, Robert E. Lee can seem to do no wrong. And by the time we get to Gettysburg, Lee has, for one thing, managed to avoid McClellan's effort to destroy him in Maryland. I mean, technically speaking, the Battle of Antietam is a Union victory.
Right.
But it doesn't seem that way, because what people expected a Union victory was going to be was George McClellan closing in and destroying Lee's army. That doesn't happen.
Right.
Then comes Fredericksburg, then comes Chancellorsville. By the time you get to Gettysburg, Union generals and Union soldiers, the rank and file, almost believe that Lee is invincible. And so, for that matter, do Lee's own soldiers. They have begun to refer to him as Uncle Robert, as Marse Robert. Marse Robert, that's an interesting piece of terminology, because what you're hearing these Confederate soldiers doing is adopting the dialect of the slave. They're saying that their relationship to Robert E. Lee is similar to the relationship of a slave at home to a white man, to a white slave owner. And that, for these soldiers in the Army of Northern Virginia who believe that they are the paladins of white supremacy, for them to adopt that terminology, Marse Robert, that reveals an awful lot about how high their opinion is of Robert E. Lee. When the Army of Northern Virginia marches to Gettysburg, the soldier letters are quite frank in their belief that the Army's morale has never been so high, confidence in Lee is stratospheric, and all they're simply going to do is wait around in Pennsylvania for an opportunity to administer the coup de grace to the Army of the Potomac and bring the Civil War to a successful conclusion.
Yeah, the Gettysburg is obviously an amazing battle that's been covered in so many places that I want to, and I've done 3 films on Gettysburg, so that's been covered other places. What I want to close with is Lee's post-war legacy, which it's difficult to find information about. And since your biography is about his whole life, was he welcomed back into the country, or did he live alone? What's his post-war legacy?
Lee lives for 5 years after the surrender at Appomattox. And in a lot of places, that's treated as kind of an afterthought, almost an appendix to the man's life, which I think is a big mistake. I mean, for one thing, it's a surprise that in late August and early September 1865, he accepts the proposition of this little college in the upper Shenandoah Valley in Lexington, Virginia, Washington College. He accepts their invitation to become their president. I mean, this is so unlikely. It's unlikely for two reasons. One is Robert E. Lee never enjoyed being an educator. He had served a stint as superintendent at West Point in the 1850s and was pretty miserable through most of it. He said at one point that he really did not have a gift for communicating information in a classroom. And he was probably correct in that self-estimate. So it's a surprise then to see him accepting this job. Just as much a surprise is that he accepts it at this tiny institution, which almost winked out under the pressure of the Civil War, in a place far removed from the circumstances he was most used to. You know, the Potomac Estuary, the Northern Neck. I mean, he's going to the Upper Shenandoah. He's going to basically to Stonewall Jackson's old neighborhood, which is a lot of very raw-boned, upright, stiff-necked Scots-Irish Presbyterians, which is a totally different environment from anything that Lee has occupied. Why does he do it? Well, in large measure, I think he wants to get away. Remember, at the end of the war, he is indicted for treason. And the only thing that's protecting him is the parole, which was issued to him and the rest of his army at Appomattox. Well, under the terms of the parole, he doesn't feel he can leave Virginia. So what does he do? He's going to find a place in Virginia as far removed from Washington, D.C. as he can get and plant himself there. And that's what he does. Now, the funny thing is, people congratulated the trustees of Washington College for landing Robert E. Lee as their president. And the congratulations all run in terms of, he'll be a great figurehead. He'll look wonderful on the letterhead. Don't let him waste his time doing too much. Oh my, were they wrong? The trustees became the figureheads. Lee takes over Washington College the same way he took over the Army of Northern Virginia. He takes over the curriculum, he takes over the faculty, he takes over fundraising. He rebuilds all of these. He builds a new curriculum. I mean, this was a college that taught straight up classics, you know, Greek and Latin, the whole early 19th century curriculum. He basically sets that aside. He's going to create a modern vocational curriculum. He's going to hire a new faculty, and he's going to bring in money. Oh my goodness, does this man shake the apple tree?
Wow. You
would never have suspected Robert E. Lee had gifts for cultivating donors, but he did. And he got money pouring in there to the point where after just 3 years in the presidency, Washington College has paid off all of its Civil War era debts. It has acquired an endowment of $250,000, which is a lot of moolah in those days.
Yeah.
And he has built a new faculty and attracted almost 400 students to the college. That's larger than the University of Virginia. That is a miracle. And I think it's safe to say that among all the successes you can attribute to Robert E. Lee in his life, nothing matches the success he enjoyed as president of Washington College. And in some respects, Rob, I think he actually spent the happiest 5 years of his life as president of Washington College. And largely because there he was able to realize those three goals that I talked about in our previous interview: independence, security, and above all, being able to run things according to his own definition of perfection, with any kind of let or hindrance. from anybody interfering. So I think he really is happier there. He doesn't, and this is a curious thing, he doesn't do something that Ulysses Grant does. When Ulysses Grant becomes president of the United States, he brings all of his old officers around with him. His old chief of staff, John Rawlins, his old military secretary, Eli Parker. He makes William Tecumseh Sherman general in chief of the United States Army. Lee does not bring his old officers to Washington College. He corresponds with some of them. He stays in touch with a little bit with Walter Taylor and Charles Marshall, his staffers. He corresponds a little bit with James Longstreet, but he never sponsors reunions. He never brings his old officers or staff together to serve him. It's as though it's not that he's lost interest in them, it's that he really is looking beyond that and just does not feel the urge that Grant did to surround himself with the familiar figures of the wartime past.
The book is called Robert E. Lee, A Life. It's out now, so I invite people to go enjoy the pleasure of reading Robert E. Lee, A Life. Thank you again, Alan, for being here.
You bet. Thank you.
That's it for this episode. Thanks again for joining me. And if you like what you hear, leave a rating, a review, or just click the follow button. You can find me on Twitter @RobChild. I'm Robert Child, and this has been Point of the Spear.
Music licensed from audioblocks.com. Point of the Spear is produced by RSC Media Group.